I knew something was wrong the moment Preston Hayes laughed into the microphone and said legacy IT overhead like it was a dirty word. He was standing up there on that makeshift stage in our break room, looking like some corporate poster boy with his rolled-up sleeves and that smug grin. The guy had his MBA fresh out of Wharton and thought he could waltz in here and restructure 25 years of solid work like it was yesterday's garbage. My name's Garrison Wells. I'm 48 years old, and I've been keeping the lights on at Midwest Manufacturing for over 2 decades. Started right after I got out of the Navy, where I spent 6 years as a communications specialist on the USS Camden. That's where I learned that when systems fail, people die. That kind of training sticks with you. Back on the ship, I was responsible for maintaining radio communications, satellite uplinks, and encrypted data channels between our vessel and fleet command. You learn real fast that there's no such thing as good enough when you're 200 miles from shore and the primary comms array goes dark during a storm. I spent countless hours in that cramped communications compartment surrounded by humming equipment, learning to read the subtle signs that told you a system was about to fail before it actually did. The Navy taught me something else. Documentation saves lives. Every maintenance check, every system anomaly, every repair had to be logged with timestamp precision. Not because some bureaucrat demanded it, but because the next guy on watch needed to know exactly what you'd found and what you'd done about it. In the military, sloppy record-keeping gets people killed. In corporate America, I was about to learn, it gets people fired. When I mustered out in 1999, Midwest Manufacturing was transitioning from paper-based systems to their first real computer network. They needed someone who understood both the technical side and the discipline required to maintain critical infrastructure. I was 23, fresh out of the service and ready to apply everything the Navy had taught me about keeping essential systems operational. 25 years later, I was watching some kid who'd never held responsibility for anything more critical than his quarterly PowerPoint presentation try to explain why my experience was obsolete. Preston was holding up a printed chart. My departmental budget, actually. I recognized the formatting because I'd built that spreadsheet myself back when we transitioned from the old ERP system. The kid was wielding my own work like a weapon, talking about optimization opportunities and streamlined headcount. We found areas where legacy practices weren't just outdated, he said, clicking to the next slide. They were actively draining resources. Then he looked directly at me. I mean, do we really need a full IT director when offshore contractors can handle basic maintenance for 1/3 the cost? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, mostly from the newer hires who still believed performance reviews mattered and thought sucking up might save their jobs. The older guys, the ones who remembered when this place actually built things instead of just managing supply chains, they stayed quiet. They knew what was coming. That's when I felt my hands go cold. Not angry cold, just the kind of steady coolness you get when all the redundant systems kick in and you realize the primary connection just failed. It's a physical response I learned on the ship. When crisis hits, your body temperature drops, your heart rate steadies, and your mind shifts into damage control mode. I stood up slowly, no drama, just like checking a server rack. In the Navy, we had a saying, stay calm, assess the situation, respond with precision. 25 years in corporate America hadn't changed that reflex. Which systems you talking about, son? I asked, loud enough to reach the back of the room. The silence that followed could have crashed a network. Preston's smile flickered for about half a second, like a monitor with a loose connection. He definitely wasn't expecting pushback from the dinosaur in the corner. Well, obviously the day-to-day maintenance, server monitoring, basic troubleshooting, he said, trying to regain his momentum. Routine stuff that doesn't require senior-level oversight. I nodded like I was processing his input, the same way I used to acknowledge transmission confirmations from the bridge. Then I walked to the front of the room, pulled out my laptop, and connected it to the projector. No theatrics, just standard protocol. Let me show you something, I said, opening up our network monitoring dashboard. This is our real-time system status. Green means operational, yellow means attention required, red means critical failure. The screen filled with dozens of indicators, most green, a few yellows scattered around. Preston glanced at it like he was reading hieroglyphics. To him, it probably looked like random lights on a Christmas tree. To me, it was a complete picture of our infrastructure's health, as readable as a ship's instrument panel. See that yellow cluster there? I pointed to a section showing elevated latency on our production servers. That's been running hot for about 6 hours. Normal fluctuation, but it needs monitoring. What's your diagnosis? Preston stared at the screen. The room waited. Somewhere in the back, someone's chair squeaked. The silence stretched out like a dead radio frequency. Well, he finally said, I'd need to consult with the technical team to determine. It's the backup cooling system in server room B, I said. Primary unit's working fine, but the backup's cycling more frequently because we're running a heavy batch process for the quarterly financials. Temperature differential is within normal parameters, but if the primary unit fails in the next 48 hours, we'd have about 12 minutes before critical systems start shutting down to prevent hardware damage. The room had gone completely quiet now. This wasn't just a tech support question anymore. This was a demonstration of the difference between theoretical knowledge and operational experience. I clicked to another screen. This is our disaster recovery status. We've got automated failover protocols, but they require manual verification at 3 checkpoints. You know what those checkpoints are, Preston. The kid was starting to sweat. That level of detail would typically be handled by the legacy overhead, I finished. The dinosaur who's been keeping your company running while you've been optimizing headcount. I closed the laptop and looked around the room. 25 years ago, I was managing communications on a destroyer. When systems fail at sea, you don't get to call tech support. You fix it with what you've got, or people die. Same principle applies here, just different stakes. Preston tried to recover. Of course we value experience, but in today's rapidly evolving technological landscape. Preston, I interrupted, how long did our system stay down during the ransomware attack last year? He blinked. I wasn't here for that incident. 4 minutes, I said. 4 minutes of downtime while I isolated the infected endpoints and rolled back to clean images. Our competitors? 3 of them were offline for over a week. You know why? I didn't wait for an answer. Because they outsourced their IT to the lowest bidder, and nobody on site knew how to respond when the automated systems couldn't handle an edge case. What I didn't tell the room was that those 4 minutes had cost me plenty. I'd been on call that entire weekend, sleeping on the couch in my empty apartment with my phone next to my head. My ex-wife Sarah used to complain that I loved that job more than I loved her. Maybe she was right. After 23 years of marriage, she'd finally had enough of playing second fiddle to system alerts and emergency calls. But hey, I said, walking back to my seat, I'm sure your contractors will figure it out when it happens again. The room was dead quiet now. Even the nervous laughers had shut up. But I could see Preston's face working through the implications of what I'd just demonstrated. The kid might have been arrogant, but he wasn't completely stupid. That night, I went home to my empty apartment. The divorce was final 2 years ago. Kids are grown and gone. And did what any old Navy communications specialist would do. I started documenting everything. My daughter Emily was finishing her senior year at Ohio State, studying engineering like her old man. My son Jake was working construction in Colorado, sending me pictures of the houses he was framing. Both of them were doing fine, but college tuition and supporting yourself in today's economy isn't cheap. I'd been helping Emily with her expenses, and Jake was saving up for a down payment on his first house. The last thing I needed was some MBA kid destroying my career and cutting off their safety net. See, Preston made one critical error in his threat assessment. He assumed I was just some aging tech guy who'd roll over and take early retirement rather than fight. What he didn't understand was that military training doesn't fade, and neither does the instinct to protect what matters. When someone declares war on your position, you don't retreat, you gather intelligence. I pulled out my files from the past 3 years, every email, every meeting note, every system log. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty for young Mr. Hayes. First, there was the pattern of age discrimination. Preston had been systematically targeting senior employees across multiple departments. 3 engineers over 50 had been restructured in the past 6 months, all replaced with contractors making half the salary and none of the institutional knowledge. Rick Parker, 44 years old, 15 years with the company, had been told his network engineering position was being consolidated with offshore support. Kevin Reynolds, 50 years old with more certifications than most IT departments combined, was offered a consulting opportunity at 40% of his previous salary. Both men had families, mortgages, kids in school. Both had been labeled as resistant to change for questioning Preston's cost-cutting measures. But the real smoking gun was in the budget allocations. Preston had created something called an Innovation Initiative Fund and been redirecting money from established departments, including $180,000 from my IT budget, into this discretionary account. Money that was supposed to go towards system upgrades and security improvements was instead funding Preston's pet projects and business development trips. I started cross-referencing the timeline of his innovations with our actual system performance metrics. The pattern was damning. March 2024. Preston redirected $45,000 from server upgrade budget to fund a cloud optimization consultant. Result: primary file server crashed twice in April, costing 8 hours of downtime and approximately $85,000 in lost productivity. May 2024. He canceled our annual security audit to save $25,000, using that money for a strategic consulting engagement in Las Vegas. 2 weeks later, we had a phishing attack that compromised 47 user accounts and required a complete password reset across the company. July 2024. Preston delayed critical network infrastructure updates, moving $60,000 to his innovation fund. The old switches started failing in August, causing intermittent connectivity issues that drove our customer service team crazy and lost us at least 2 major accounts. Every time Preston made a decision that impacted IT operations, downtime increased and costs went up. His cost-cutting measures had resulted in $340,000 worth of productivity losses in the past quarter alone. I had the logs to prove it, timestamps and all. The network forensics told an even uglier story. Every efficiency improvement Preston implemented made our systems less stable, not more. His offshore contractors were competent enough for routine maintenance, but when real problems hit, they were useless. They worked bankers' hours in Mumbai while our crises happened at 2 a.m. on Saturday nights. I remembered one particularly bad weekend when the backup power system failed during a routine maintenance window. The offshore team's solution was to log a ticket and wait for Monday. I'd driven to the office in my pajamas and spent 6 hours rewiring the UPS connections to keep our servers online. Preston's Innovation Fund paid for that weekend too. Not my overtime, but a consulting report on power management optimization that recommended exactly the setup we'd been using for 5 years. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a conference room with Bill Morrison, our CFO. Bill's 61 years old, been with the company since before Preston was born. He's the kind of executive who actually worked his way up from the shop floor and understands that experience has value. "Show me what you've got, Garrison," Bill said, settling back in his chair. I spread out the documentation like a technical manual. Email threads showing Preston's incompetence costing us downtime. Financial records proving budget misallocation. EEOC guidelines on age discrimination patterns. Everything cross-referenced and indexed, just like we used to do for fleet communications protocols. Bill studied the evidence for 20 minutes without saying a word. He's old school, the kind of guy who reads every line of a contract before signing it. Finally, he looked up and said, "This is either the most thorough character assassination I've ever seen, or we've got a serious problem." "Sir, I don't deal in character assassination," I replied. "I deal in system analysis, and the system's showing critical vulnerabilities." That's when Bill smiled. "What do you recommend?" "Full audit, outside counsel for the discrimination issues, internal investigation on the budget irregularities, and maybe someone should check Preston's expense reports from those innovation trips." 2 days later, Claire Rodriguez from Martinez and Associates law firm was sitting in my kitchen, reviewing my documentation. Claire specializes in employment law, particularly age discrimination cases. She's 52, sharp as a blade, and has seen this pattern before. "This is textbook," she said, spreading the papers across my small dining table. "Systematic targeting of senior employees, replacement with cheaper alternatives, creation of hostile work environment based on age-related stereotypes. The budget irregularities just make it worse." "What's our next move?" I asked, pouring her another cup of coffee. "We file a formal complaint with EEOC and simultaneously pursue whistleblower protection under Sarbanes-Oxley for the financial irregularities. But first, I want to talk to the other affected employees." That's how I ended up in touch with Rick Parker and Kevin Reynolds, 2 senior guys who'd been pushed out in Preston's restructuring. Rick's 44, been with the company for 15 years as a network engineer. Started right out of college, worked his way up, knew our systems inside and out. Kevin's 50, systems admin with more certifications than most college IT departments. Both had their positions eliminated and were offered consulting opportunities at 40% of their previous salaries. We met at a diner off Route 30, away from company property. The place was one of those old truck stops with vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint, but it was neutral ground and nobody from Midwest manufacturing would accidentally overhear us. Rick brought his separation agreement, Kevin had his personnel file, and I had my evidence folder. "They got you too, huh?" Rick said when I laid out Preston's pattern of targeting experienced staff. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from months of job hunting when you're over 40 and every posting wants digital natives and fresh perspectives. "Worse," Kevin replied, stirring sugar into his coffee with mechanical precision. "They offered me a contractor position doing the exact same job for half the money and no benefits. When I refused, they said I was being inflexible and resistant to change." Kevin had 3 kids, twin boys in high school and a daughter starting middle school. His wife worked part-time at the local library. Losing his health insurance alone was going to cost them $800 a month, money they didn't have. "Preston called me into his office last month," Rick said. "Told me that network engineering was becoming automated and that companies needed people who could think outside traditional infrastructure paradigms. I asked him what that meant, and he started talking about cloud-native solutions and software-defined networking like he'd just read a Wikipedia article. Did he actually understand any of it? I asked. Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. The guy thought DNS was a new social media platform. I had to explain to him why we couldn't just move everything to the cloud without redesigning our entire security architecture first. That's when Kevin pulled out his phone and showed us something that made my blood pressure spike. "Look at this job posting," he said. "They're hiring for my old position. Same responsibilities, same requirements, but they're calling it Junior Systems Specialist and offering $35,000 a year." I looked at the posting. It was word for word identical to Kevin's old job description, except they'd changed minimum 10 years experience to 1 to 3 years preferred and added buzzwords like collaborative mindset and adaptable to changing priorities. "They're going to hire some kids straight out of college," Kevin said. "Someone who'll work 60-hour weeks for peanuts and won't question why the documentation is incomplete or why the backup systems haven't been tested in 6 months. Claire Rodriguez had warned me this would be the hardest part, not just proving discrimination, but showing the pattern across multiple employees. But sitting in that diner, listening to Rick and Kevin describe identical experiences to my own, the case was building itself. "There's something else," Rick said, lowering his voice. "You know Janet Cooper in HR? She pulled me aside last week, said she was sorry about how things went down, told me that Preston had a list." "What kind of list?" I asked. "Names and ages. Everyone over 45 in technical positions. She said he'd been working through it systematically, finding reasons to eliminate positions or force people into early retirement. That explained a lot. The pattern wasn't random. It was methodical. Preston had been conducting a purge, getting rid of anyone old enough to remember how things were supposed to work, anyone with enough experience to question his decisions. Janet's scared," Rick continued. "She's 58, been with the company for 20 years. She thinks she's next on the chopping block, but she can't afford to lose her job. Her husband's got medical issues." I thought about Janet, always professional, always by the book, the kind of HR person who actually tried to protect employees instead of just covering for management. If Preston was targeting her too, then nobody was safe. "Would she be willing to testify?" Claire had asked during our first meeting. "Not officially," I'd told her, "but she might be willing to provide documentation if she knew it could stop this from happening to other people." The more we talked, the clearer the picture became. Preston wasn't just cutting costs. He was systematically destroying institutional knowledge, gambling that short-term savings would outweigh the long-term damage. He was betting that offshore contractors and fresh college graduates could replace decades of experience. What he didn't count on was that some of us old-timers had learned a thing or two about fighting back. The EEOC complaint was filed on a Tuesday. By Friday, Preston was called into an emergency meeting with Bill Morrison, the head of HR, and 2 attorneys from outside counsel. I wasn't in the room, but Janet Cooper looked like she'd seen a ghost when she came out. The internal audit began the following Monday. Lisa Bennett from our finance department, she's 38, sharp with numbers, and doesn't tolerate nonsense, started tracing every dollar that had flowed through Preston's Innovation Fund. Garrison, she said, pulling me aside on Wednesday, some of these expenses are creative. 3 business development trips to Las Vegas, 2 conferences in Miami, and a $15,000 consulting contract with a company that doesn't seem to exist. Ghost vendor? I asked. Looks like it. The address traces back to a UPS store, no website, no phone listing. Just invoices for strategic consulting services signed off by Preston himself. I wasn't surprised. In the Navy, we'd seen similar schemes, officers creating fake suppliers to skim money from operations budgets. The military called it fraud. Corporate America had fancier names for it, but it was the same crime. There's more, Lisa continued, lowering her voice. Remember that cloud optimization consultant he hired, the one who recommended we delay server upgrades? I nodded. Turns out the consultant was Preston's college roommate. Guy runs a one-man marketing firm in Chicago, doesn't know the first thing about IT infrastructure, but he billed us $45,000 for a 20-page report that was mostly copied from vendor white papers. The picture was getting uglier by the day. Preston hadn't just been discriminating against older employees. He'd been stealing from the company to fund his lifestyle and pay off his friends. By Thursday, Preston's office was cleaned out. HR issued a statement about personnel changes in the operations division and commitment to compliance with all employment regulations. No drama, no perp walk, just gone. But the real satisfaction came during the settlement negotiations. Claire Rodriguez sat across from their legal team like a general planning a siege. The company wanted to resolve everything quietly, without admissions of wrongdoing. Fine by me. I wasn't looking for vindication, I was looking for justice. They're scared, Claire told me during a break in negotiations. The EEOC complaint is bad enough, but the financial irregularities open them up to SEC investigation. They want this to disappear. The terms were better than I'd hoped. Full reinstatement for me, Rick, and Kevin. Back pay for all affected employees. Promotion for me to Chief Technology Officer with a salary of $145,000, nearly double my previous pay. $50,000 settlement for emotional distress and legal fees. Full restoration of pension credits and 5 additional years of service time. Oh, and mandatory age discrimination training for all management personnel, conducted by an outside consultant. What about Preston? I asked Claire. She smiled. That's not our problem anymore, but I hear through the grapevine that he's working for a startup in Austin making about 60% of what he was pulling down here. His stock options were forfeited when he was terminated for cause. The best part? The SEC was still investigating the Innovation Fund irregularities. Word was that federal investigators had seized his laptop and were going through his expense reports with a fine-tooth comb. I started as CTO 3 weeks later. My first initiative was a comprehensive security audit and infrastructure upgrade, using that $180,000 Preston had diverted, plus additional budget allocation approved by Bill Morrison. We were also establishing a mentorship program pairing senior technical staff with younger employees because that's how you actually transfer knowledge instead of just eliminating it. Rick Parker became my deputy CTO. Kevin Reynolds was hired back as head of our new cybersecurity division. We brought in 2 more senior engineers to replace the institutional knowledge Preston had tried to outsource. Turns out that when you combine decades of experience with proper resource allocation and respect for expertise, you get results that no offshore contractor can match. The offshore team? We kept them for routine maintenance during their business hours, but critical operations stayed in-house. Amazing how much more stable our systems became when the people responsible for fixing them actually understood how they worked. Within 6 months, our system uptime was at 99.7%, highest in company history. Productivity was up 23% since the new management structure took effect. Even the bean counters were happy because proper planning prevents expensive emergency fixes. Customer complaints about system slowdowns dropped by 80%. We hadn't lost a single major account to technical issues. The 2 accounts we'd lost during Preston's reign, both came back, impressed by our improved reliability. Emily graduated from Ohio State that spring with her engineering degree. I was able to pay off her student loans completely, something I couldn't have done on my old salary. Jake bought his house in Colorado and I helped with the down payment. Having that financial security meant everything, especially knowing how close I'd come to losing it all. Preston Hayes? I heard through industry contacts that his Austin startup folded after 6 months. Investors pulled out when they discovered some irregularities in the financial projections. Funny how that pattern seemed to follow him around. Last I heard, he was working for a mid-sized consulting firm, making barely $75,000 a year. No stock options, no innovation fund, no authority to restructure anything more complex than his own desk setup. These days, when I walk through the server room checking connection status and listening to the steady hum of properly maintained equipment, I remember that lesson from my Navy days. When you're responsible for keeping critical systems operational, you don't cut corners, you don't ignore warning signs, and you definitely don't underestimate the guys who've been keeping the lights on while you were still learning to tie your shoes. Preston Hayes found that out the hard way. But that's what happens when you mistake experience for obsolescence and think an MBA can replace 2 decades of knowing exactly which wire connects to what. Some systems you just don't mess with, and some old dogs know exactly how to bite back when cornered. In the end, I learned that respect isn't given based on your age or your years of service. It's earned by proving that when the chips are down, you're the one they can count on to keep the lights on and the systems running. Preston thought he could optimize away decades of hard-earned knowledge, but what he discovered too late is that there's no algorithm for experience, no shortcut for competence, and no substitute for the kind of steady reliability that only comes from people who understand that some battles are worth fighting